All right, looking at this particular example, notice I have a couple triangles floating around. Really, there's three triangles. There's the overall big triangle, and then there's two little triangles inside of that one. And so when we start to think about the idea of a bunch of triangles kind of all together, we have a couple things at play here. One, each of those triangles is going to have a angle measurement that adds up to 180 degrees, okay? And so there's a couple things that we can do to approach this, all right? Notice it says find the measure of angle E. Most students, when they look at this, will go the route of saying, you know what? I can find Y and I can find X. So a lot of students will do this. They'll look at this and say, okay, so for this particular example, I can look at this and say that first triangle, which is this guy, the one that has the 27, the 40, and the Y, that's going to add up to 180 degrees, okay? And so we can easily find Y by just looking at this and saying, okay, these two added together, that's 67 degrees. And now I do the 180 minus the 67 degrees, okay? And when I do that, let's see, that gives me a 113 degrees. Well, that's my Y value. So now I've found the measurement for Y. We can also look at this and say, hey, look at X and Y. If I look at X and Y together, I can see that those form a line when you look at this thing. And so because they form a line, they're that special thing that we call a linear pair. Remember, lines always add up to 180 degrees also, which means these guys together have to be 180 degrees. And so if I want to find the measure of angle X, I do 180 degrees minus the 113 degrees. And when I subtract that, that gives me a 67. So now I know that X is a 67 degree angle, all right? And now, as I look at this thing, I can now take a look at that smaller triangle and say, hey, look at the smaller triangle. In the smaller triangle over here, the three angles have to add up to 180 degrees. So once again, I could add the two angles that I have, the 36 and the 67. Those add up to 103 degrees. So to find the missing angle, I do 180 minus the 103 degrees. Okay? And when I do that, that gives me a 77 degree angle. And so that's the measure of angle E. The measure of angle E is 77 degrees. Okay? And that was just kind of going through and saying, hey, these are all the things that I know add up to 180. I know that each triangle adds up to 180, and I know that something that forms a line adds up to 180. But here's the other option. And this one, even though this is a little bit faster, I think most students find it more difficult. I don't actually need to find angles X and Y, okay? Because if I look at the overall triangle, so if I look at the big triangle as a whole, the three angles in the big triangle have to add up to 180 degrees. So this angle, this whole angle, and this angle should equal 180 degrees. And what I have to do is I have to use a little bit of angle addition. I have to first identify that this whole angle up top here, all right, is those two angles added together. That's a 76 degree angle overall, okay? So if I kind of ignored these for a second and said, hey, this whole thing is 76 degrees, well, now look at that big triangle. If I just kind of ignore that line that's going down through there and ignore the X and the Y, the three angles inside that big triangle have to add up to 180 degrees. And so if I add up the two angles that I have here, the 27 degrees and the 76 degrees, that gives me 103 degrees. So now I do the 180 minus the 103. And that, of course, gives me the 77 degree angle, which is the one that I'm left with. Okay? So notice there's a couple ways to do this. I can look at each of those triangles individually, and I can say, hey, each triangle adds up to 180 degrees. And then I have to use that idea of a line makes 180 degrees, and I can find all of these little pieces. I can find X, I can find Y, and I can find the missing angle E. But I could look at the overall triangle and say, hey, if I have enough pieces, the three angles of the big triangle add up to 180 degrees as well. Okay? And so sometimes it's beneficial to look at the smaller pieces if I wanted to find X or Y, all right? Or if I need to find one of those smaller angles. But sometimes we can kind of zoom out a little bit and look at the big triangle as well, all right? It really depends on the situation, all right? But again, any angles add up together using angle addition, so we can use that in here. Any angles that form a line add up to 180, and all three angles inside a triangle add up to 180 as well. Okay?